All right. Thanks for joining us today for our lunch presentation on sales tax for manufacturers in New York State. If you purchase machinery, equipment, parts, tools, supplies, and utilities for your production process, you're in the right spot for the information you're going to get today. Also want to just take a minute and welcome our Buffalo Niagara Manufacturing Alliance members for joining us today. I'm Carolyn Powell, Business Development Director here at Tronconi Seguir & Associates, and I'll be your host today. Real quick, you'll see a toolbar on the right-hand side of your screen. There you will find handouts. We have two handouts today. One is the presentation, so you may want to download that, and also a sheet that is Meet the Experts, so that's full bios of our experts today. There is a chat section that you can send me any informal notes on technology. Let me know what you're having for lunch. I haven't eaten yet, so make me hungry. But different ways you can engage with us. We are going to save questions to follow up after the presentation, so you can save those for now. After the presentation, you will receive a survey from us. If you could please fill that out. Give us some feedback, and then let us know if you want to talk with one of the experts one-on-one, or if you need help in another area of accounting and tax. So without further ado, let's get started. Again, just real quickly, Tronconi Seguir & Associates, we're a certified public accounting firm and business consulting. Tom Mazurek is a CPA and has over 20 years of public accounting experience. Andy Toth, also CPA, and over 30 years experience in both public and private sectors. Again, their full bios are in the handouts that you can see. Both of them have great depth of experience in manufacturing, and we'll be able to give you some information that'll be able to help you today. So without further ado, Tom, want to get started?
Yeah, thank you, Carolyn, for the introduction. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for spending an hour or so with us today to talk about sales tax, everyone's favorite topic, at least Andy and my favorite topic. What we're going to do today, if you can see the topics here on the slide, we're just going to go over the production exemption for manufacturers here in New York for sales and use tax. Like Carolyn said, it covers machinery, equipment, parts, tools, supplies, utilities, and a lot of other things manufacturers use in their production process. These slides are pretty heavy, they're pretty thick, a lot of information on them, but we try to be as thorough as possible so you can use these slides as a reference for guidance in the future. So getting into it right away here on the next slide, what are we talking about today? We're talking about the production exemption. And this is an exemption from New York sales and use tax for businesses that produce tangible personal property for sale. Now, there's two key elements to what I just said. You're producing tangible personal property, something that could be, felt, touched, seen, and it has to be for sale. You can't be a contractor who's using tangible personal property or self-manufacturing something, then installing it. There's a whole other situation when it comes to that. So you're producing an item of TPP that's going to be sold, for resale to an end user or whatnot. If you're doing that, then you're entitled to this production exemption that we're talking about here. And on the next slide, as Carolyn said, the exemption, covers a wide range of purchases from machinery and equipment to parts, to tools, supplies, utilities, and fuel that's used or consumed in what we call the production process. And we're going to get into each of these specific exemptions and the different categories of purchases and talk a little bit about some examples and what qualifies for exemption. Andy and I have a lot of stories from over the years of some interesting things that if you just looked at it, you would have been, that's taxable. How's that used in production? But it ended up, being exempt because our client was using it in an exempt manner. So we talk about what is this production process? It's anything that, is used in production, you have an exemption for. Anything that is used before or after production does not qualify. And You have to be careful about that. We've run into a lot of instances over the years with manufacturers who thought everything they're buying, for the whole facility was exempt from tax because of the manufacturing exemption, and it's not. You have to look very closely at the production process, which we'll talk about, and the activities that are in that process, not before, not after. So production, obviously, based on these definitions, are all for sales tax purposes. Production is the means by which products are created using one of the following operations. And these are the operations that the New York State guidance really goes into: manufacturing, processing, assembling, generating, refining, mining, and extracting. We're really not going to talk too much about anything with that. Just looking at the attendees today, there's really nobody that we saw based on the email addresses and company names for people who are in those industries. So we're going to focus on these three this afternoon. So what are these processes? Manufacturing, generally results in the creation of a new product that is substantially different in form or character or composition. For example, take a steel manufacturer. They're combining iron and carbon with some heat, and they're making, a commercial piece of steel that you're going to use. Processing, again, processing is really not the same as manufacturing. Really, you're just taking an existing item and maybe changing the nature, the shape, or the form of those materials. One of the things I think of one of our clients in the past was coating company that applies like a electrical-based coating to tools that make them harder, more durable for future use. That's processing. You're really not coming up with something new. You're just changing the nature of that material. And then finally, assembling. Pretty obvious to anyone who's a manufacturer. Assembling is an actual manufacturing operation. It's like an adjunct to manufacturing, where you're just combining or fitting pieces together to make a complete product. So if you're in that business, you're doing one of those three things, you qualify for this exemption. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about the production process here, and the beginning and the end. So where does it start? Where does it end for sales tax purposes? Like we said earlier, anything that happens before or after that process is not going to be exempt, only within that process. So that's key to know. So the point of begins and ends depends on the operation. Generally speaking, for manufacturing, processing, and assembly type operations, production begins when the materials that serve as your raw materials are received at the production site. So at the loading dock, when those materials come in at the loading dock, that's typically where production starts in New York. And I say in New York because Andy and I do work for clients all across the country, and production definitions and whatnot, what's exempt is different in every other state. So we're just going to talk about New York here. So it begins when it hits the loading dock. There's some exceptions to it. It's sales tax, there always is, and we'll get into that. And then production typically ends when the product is completed, packaged, and ready to be sold. So that's kind of the general definition of the beginning and the end of the production process. So as we go back to the beginning of the production process here on the next slide, we talk about when these materials are coming in. We said at the loading dock. Well, what happens if you're doing something to those materials after they arrive? Are you weighing them? Are you inspecting them, or measuring, or testing, or inventorying them? Really looking at the quality, making sure it's up to the specific standards or parameters that you purchased. If that's the case, if you're doing something really to determine the quality of the materials or other type of testing on them, then the production process gets kicked back a little. It doesn't start then at the loading dock. It'll start after you do your initial testing and you place those materials in storage. So if you're doing something between the time it comes in and the time you're placing them in storage, you're doing this testing or whatnot, it's going to shift the production process back a little. Now, if all you're doing is you're checking the shipping manifest to make sure if you ordered 100 pieces or 100 cartons, you got 100 cartons, that's not going to rise to this inspection or testing. Production will still begin at that point. But as we talk later about different types of purchases, like material handling equipment, depending on where the production process starts, may determine whether or not that equipment's exempt at that point of time. So that's the beginning of the process. And then at the end of the process, we said production ends when the product is completed and in the form and packaging which it's going to be sold. So if you pack it into boxes, you seal the boxes, and that's how you're selling that product, that's the end of the production process. Now, it does get a little tricky. Let's say if you're having a palletizer in there, the palletizer is, taking different cartons and stacking them on a pallet and then wrapping them. Yes, then you're selling it like that. That's the end of production. For example, we talk about an interruption here in the production cycle. Let's just say you're a private label manufacturer and you make just cans of a certain item of product, but you don't label them because it might go to different private label manufacturers. So you take those cans, you put them in storage. When you get an order, you bring them back to the line, slap the labels on them, and then package them up. That's fine. That's just an interruption in the production cycle. It's not going to terminate the production process for you. However, at the point where you're transporting completed product, if it's packed, it's in cartons, it's palletized, from the minute that happens, if you bring the forklift over to take it to the warehouse for storage, production has ended at that point. That forklift is after the production process and moving it to the distribution plant for storage or shipment. That's all going to be outside the production process. So have to be kind of clear, have to have an understanding of where your production starts and ends in order to make sure you're paying or not paying tax on the right purchases, the right equipment and whatnot. So at this point, Andy, you want to jump in and talk about purchases by manufacturers, what qualifies for the production exemption?
Sure. I just want to correct a little bit of the introduction by Carolyn. I've actually been doing this for over 40 years. So thank you for making me much younger than I am. Over 30 years in public accounting, but prior to that, I worked in industry. I really began in industry at Columbus McKinnon when they did actually still manufacture chains in New York State. So that was my introduction to manufacturing processes. And I worked my way up to a plant controller for a large printing facility in New York State. So I'm familiar with the problems that plant controllers, accounting personnel have in facilities because I lived that life for a number of years. So to get on with sales tax and the manufacturing, as Tom said, most people like to think everything that they buy in their manufacturing facility is going to be exempt, and unfortunately, New York State does not agree with that, and they have a two-pronged test that they use. That test is whatever you're buying has got to be used directly and predominantly in the manufacturing process. So let's go over the direct test first, and New York State defines that as anything that's acting upon or affecting change in the materials to form the product to be sold. Anything that has an active causal relationship in the production of the product to be sold. Anything that's used in handling, storing, conveying, moving it throughout the manufacturing process. And then the last part is that equipment that's putting it into the final packaging. So, things that are acting upon, I mean, that's pretty easy to identify. That's your equipment out on the shop floor that's actually touching the product, whether it's a CNC machine cutting the metal, a stamping machine, drill presses, printing presses, anything that's actually touching it. Things that affect change, now you're getting more into possibly chemical processes, catalysts, other areas that may not be physically touching the parts that you're manufacturing are ovens, that may be used to cure product, dryers that need to dry product before it can be put into packaging, final assembly, But all those areas, even though they're not touching, they're part of that process. The causal relationship gets a little bit more vague, but Tom had talked about thin film coating process earlier. So basically, you're going to take parts and you're going to put them in one of these coating vessels. And, the coating vessel isn't doing anything to that. And, what's really happening is you've got a target of material that you want to attract that tool that's being manufactured. The tool's going to have a positive charge, the target's going to have a negative charge. And when the electricity is turned on to that coating vessel, it's probably going to pass through some kind of gas, and it's going to permanently attach to that tool that you want coated. So that's a causal relationship. It's not actually hammering on the product, it's not cutting the product, but it is making that change that is making that tool harder, more wear resistant, more heat resistant. I did have some discussions with auditors about, we're not really changing anything when we do that, because, the part goes in and it may have a grayish color or it comes out gold. There's a change that happened there. Same thing with heat treating. When you put something in a heat treating oven, it's going to come out looking the same, but it's going to be, depending on what process you're doing and what you're trying to achieve, it's probably going to be harder, more wear resistant. So there's been a chemical change to that product. So handling equipment, that's pretty straightforward. That's your forklifts, overhead cranes, pallet jacks. So any of that equipment that's used in the beginning of the production process that Tom was talking to the end of the production process, those pieces of equipment are going to be exempt. Storage areas, freezers in a meat processing plant are going to be exempt. We have one client that's got to store material in an area that's 4% humidity, or else it blows up. So, that particular area of the plant is the equipment in there, the equipment used to reach that humidity goal, all that's going to be exempt. Storage racks for raw materials and storage racks for work in process are going to be exempt. But finished goods are not going to be exempt. And then you've got your machinery and equipment that's going to place your product into the final packaged form, which is all going to be still part of the production process. So the next test is the predominant test, and that's easily defined as over 50%. And again, your equipment out on your shop floor, that's pretty easy. You're using it in production every day. Probably doesn't have a lot of other uses other than producing product for sale. Where you get into some gray areas is where you've got a piece of equipment that you're also using to make warranty repairs, repairs to items that you've sold. It may be doing calibration work. Any of that equipment that is used 50% or more of the time for making repair work is not going to be qualifying equipment for the New York State exemption. And then you've got fork trucks is a common one, depending on the size of your facility. Large facilities will have fork trucks dedicated to unloading, moving stuff through the production area, moving stuff over to your finished goods area, and then you've got your warehousing fork trucks. So those are all pretty defined areas. Smaller places, though, you may have one fork truck that's doing all of that stuff. And so what you really got to do is determine whether or not that fork truck is used 50% or more of the time in that defined production area that Tom is talking about. So if you've got a fork truck that's unloading stuff that you're going to weigh and test, that move from the truck that you unloaded to the weighing and testing area before you accepting an inventory, that is not a production area. And I think we had a client years ago with a locomotive.
Yep.
that was moving coal into a utility facility. And so basically they were weighing the coal before they were accepting it to inventory. So that made the locomotive not qualify. If they not weighed the coal, the locomotive would have qualified as part of the production process. So other things you got to think about for meeting this 50% of product to be sold, as Tom talked about this a little bit earlier, is manufacturing for self-use. So I had a pretty large HVAC contractor that had a pretty good size assembly plant for their ductwork. And, some of that they sold, but over 50% of that they used themselves in their jobs. So, they were taking the sheet metal, they were bending it, they were forming it, they were welding it, they were, getting it ready for their jobs. But because most of the time they were doing it for their jobs, none of that equipment qualified for manufacturing exemption. So what doesn't qualify? And we've hit a lot of this already. Stuff that's outside of the production area. So nothing in your parking lot's going to qualify. Those lights out there aren't going to qualify. The safety cones out there don't qualify. It has nothing to do with production. So these are all things, again, we got to look to where the beginning of that process is. The offloading of the raw materials. Again, if you're going to weigh it and inspect it before you accept it in the inventory, that those processes don't count. That equipment you use for inspection doesn't count. That equipment used for weighing doesn't count. Those are all going to be taxable. And then, of course, you get to the end of the process. Once you've assembled your product. So, take, I've got a tour of a large cereal manufacturer plant here. You've got your box of cereal, and you get a bunch of boxes and you put it in a carton. Then you get a bunch of cartons and you put it on a pallet. And then they shrink wrap those pallets. After they shrink wrap those pallets, they're pretty much done with production. So now they're moving it into the finished goods warehouse. And any of those warehouse moves is going to be by taxable equipment. You got taxable racks in there. Everything in that warehouse is taxable. At one time, that particular facility had almost a mile-long warehouse in New York State, in Buffalo. They don't anymore, but you've got a lot of equipment in there. But again, it's all going to be taxable because it's not part of the production process. So other things that aren't going to be eligible. You guys that are doing their purchasing, using their computers for purchasing, the trucks sending out the transport raw materials, testing raw materials I've already talked about. None of that stuff is going to qualify. It's all outside the production process. Your general office, your accounting, your sales, your clerical work, none of that is qualifying. Although essential to the manufacturing process, because if you don't get the invoices out, you don't count the cash, you're not going to be in business long. But again, we go back to that directly and predominantly test, and those things don't meet it. Your general maintenance and janitorial services, keep the premises clean. Again, you're going to fail that predominant test. You're going to fail that direct test. Those items are not going to qualify.
You're a real downer. Are you going to talk about what actually qualifies for the exemption at some point, or what?
Welcome to New York State.
Yeah, exactly.
And I know we have at least one audit on there. I apologize. So when you're purchasing your raw materials and things that are going to be qualifying for the production process, supplies and things of that nature, we want to afford or avoid a cascading of taxes. So you don't want to be paying sales tax on stuff you're buying that is going to be exempt, because once you pay that sales tax, there's only two ways to get it back, and neither one of them are a good answer. One is you got to file a refund claim with New York State. That's going to go through an examination. It's going to take a long time to get your cash back. The other one is you're going to take a credit on your sales tax return for some of those items, and you've got to pretty much provide detail, almost as much as a refund claim of why you want that money back. So the best thing to do is when you're buying stuff that is qualifying, issue an SP-120 resale certificate, send it to your vendor. They shouldn't charge you the sales tax, and that'll take care of that problem of you needing to get the tax back later. Got the same issue with manufacturing equipment. Anything that that's going to be directly and predominantly used, that's going to meet those tests, you don't want to be paying sales tax on trying to get it back later. You want to get that tax taken off right up front so you don't have to deal with it. And you're going to issue an SP-121 exempt use certificate.
And with those, Andy, do I have to issue that every time?
No, there's blanket certificates out there. So there's a box you can check. It says blanket, one time done. Great thing about New York State is those certificates never expire. If you're making purchases and others say, well, I don't want to get into that because
It's a whole other one.
that's a whole other ball of wax. But other states do have expiring certificates. So
Did you just sign us up for another webinar, Andy?
sure, next year. Material handling equipment. We've touched a lot on this. We've focused on fork trucks, but you've also got like conveyor belt systems. And we've been in facilities where these belt systems are a mile long. We've seen them where they're 3 and 4 stories high. And so you've got to look at those and you got to figure out where production begins and ends, because it's a continuous process with these belts. And, you got to determine whether that conveyor system's used 50% or more of the time in the production area. Overhead cranes are another one. You've got an overhead crane in the shipping area, that's probably not going to qualify. You've got an overhead crane, that's pre-accepting it into raw materials, that crane's not going to qualify. You got an overhead crane in the production area that's moving goods and materials throughout the process, that crane's going to be good. So other areas to think about for sales tax exemption, installing and maintaining your equipment. So installing and maintaining, these exemptions fall along the lines of what is the equipment. So if the equipment's going to be exempt, installing the equipment's going to be exempt. If you're installing equipment in that testing area before production, that equipment's taxable, the installation is going to be taxable. In your maintenance and servicing and repairing, it's the same thing. That equipment used on your shop floor, taking care of that stuff, you bring an outside company in to do the service on it, give them a manufacturing exemption certificate, you shouldn't be paying sales tax on that. The testing equipment that you're using before you're accepting stuff in inventory, that stuff's going to be taxable. On-site assembly, this is probably going to happen when you buy a new piece of equipment. And unless you've got really large doors on your shop, a lot of equipment's not going to fit through the door, and it's going to need to come in pieces, be assembled when it gets there. You're buying stuff from overseas, that's most likely going to come in pieces. You're going to need to assemble it when it gets there. That assembly, again, goes with the equipment. If the equipment's exempt, the assembly is going to be exempt. I think of a plant like the where they built that for safety during World War II, so everything is like small compartments walled off, so they won't lose the whole plant. Anytime they do a major tooling change in there, it's got to be a huge headache.
The equipment in there is so large.
It's large, and the rooms are small.
Yeah, it's the strangest plant if you've ever been in, but it makes sense.
Yeah. Rigging services, large pieces of equipment, so now you need to bring in a specialized service to move that stuff around. Again, it's going to follow the machinery and equipment. If that equipment's exempt, then the rigging services are going to be exempt. So machines break down, you need replacement parts for them. Any of those parts that are for production equipment, they're going to be exempt. Parts that are used in non-production areas, not exempt. So, an area we run into this where you're getting a large order from Fastenal, and you're getting a bunch of screws and bolts and stuff. Maintenance guys are going to use that for different things in the plant that aren't part of production. Those screws and bolts need to be taxed. The stuff that you're using in the production area, that stuff is all going to qualify for the manufacturing.
Yeah, you're right there too, Andy. Anytime you run into McMaster car, Fastenal, Granger, MSC, you're always going to be dealing with a mixed bag probably.
Yeah,
some stuff exempted.
Those invoices have everything all over them. You can buy anything from toilet paper to machine motors from those guys. And then they always throw in the free t-shirts. So there's lots of taxable items in there. Okay, so tools used in production. this gets a little bit confusing, but think of it this way. The tools that are used by the machine operators, the stuff that's sitting right around the equipment, that stuff's going to be exempt. The tools used by your maintenance shop that they're using to fix your machinery and equipment, that stuff's going to be taxable. So just if you think of it in those terms, you should be pretty good with what's exempt and what's taxable as far as your hand tools and your small electric tools go. That's all I got.
For now, back to me. So I'm going to pick it up with supplies used in production. So any type of supplies such as, your oils, your greases, sandpaper, solvents, thinners that are used directly and predominantly in the production process are exempt. Also, if they're used in the maintenance of exempt production equipment, obviously you need some oil, some lubricating grease on your machinery, that's going to be exempt from tax. Sometimes it gets a little tricky with this. I had a client once that manufactured in these large kettles, a real greasy type compound, and then, moved on. So they had to clean the kettles. Well, we were looking at their purchases and they were buying Dawn dish detergent. Like a lot of it, like to the point where it can't be for the kitchen. They're not going to be using this much in the employee kitchen here. So we talked about it and they said, oh, well, yeah, Dawn is the best thing that removes grease and oil. So we buy it in these huge gallon packs and we use it to clean the kettles before we manufacture the next batch of the compound. So stuff like that, sometimes you look at it and you're like, what is going on with this? And I think Andy's got a couple examples later too, where you're like, wow, that's used in manufacturing, that would be exempt. So it's always tricky. You got to watch out for things like that. Motor fuel, diesel motor fuel. If you're using any of these in production process, maybe you've got some motors or saws or something that's running on fuel, you can't purchase motor fuel or enhanced diesel tax exempt in New York State. You can claim a refund for it if it's used directly. And this doesn't say predominantly, it says exclusively in the production process. And Andy will talk about that when he talks about utilities. It's a higher threshold than predominance, exclusively pretty much greater than 90%. It has to be used for that specific function or piece of equipment. You can claim a refund for the motor fuel like that using this FT 500 form, which there's a link to here. On the other hand, with residual type petroleum products, unenhanced diesel motor fuel, number 2 fuel oil, maybe you're using it in a boiler that's generating steam that's used in the production process, that kind of stuff you can purchase tax exempt using that ST 121 or the manufacturing certification FT 1012. So there are alternatives with that. You just have to watch what you're buying and how it's exempt for sales tax purposes for fuels. Next one of my favorites, one of the most complex issues, no matter when you talk about it with sales tax, is computer software. So if you're buying software that is used to actually run a piece of exempt production machinery and equipment, it's exempt from sales tax. It has to be used to actually operate that machinery, program the design or the sketch or the mold for the CNC machine. We talk to a lot of clients who have these high-end ERP systems, your SAP, your PeopleSoft, and they say, well, it interacts with the product being produced. It's providing information about tracking, scheduling, shipping. Those aren't production activities. They're administrative, they're distribution activities. So that software, while it has some production elements to it, does not operate the machinery. Neither is QuickBooks. So, any of that software you're typically buying is got to be taxable. You're going to be buying specific software from like an Allen Bradley or some company like that that's used to run, this machinery and equipment for you. Talking about computer software could be a whole other webinar too.
Oh,
Don't get any ideas there.
I like it.
So then we'll talk about another sometimes misunderstood cartons, containers, and other packaging materials. You know, typically any type of packaging material that is being transferred with the product is going to be eligible for exemption. You know, obviously, we've got to include any type of bags or bottles, boxes, cans, cartons, cellophane, drums, pallets, which we'll talk about, strapping, string, twine, anything like that that is going along with the product has got to be exempt. I had a client once, heavy manufacturer. We noticed they're buying all this wood. We're like, what's all the wood for? You know, it's some kind of construction project. No, it was used by the shipping department to make their own boxes and containers and heavier pallets because they're putting this big spools of copper wire and whatnot in them. They needed their own packaging material. They were building it themselves. You know, Andy, you've got a good example of packaging.
Yeah, garbage bags. I was doing a refund study for a client and I noticed they were just buying a ton of garbage bags. The facility was not that big. You know, there's maybe 10 cans in the facility. And, you know, of course, paying sales tax on it because, you know, the company selling them wouldn't be thinking otherwise. They're using them for garbage. But what they were using it for was packaging. They had a very sensitive material that they were packaging up, very sensitive to heat and humidity. So they needed those garbage bags sealed up tight to keep the humidity away from that product during the shipping process.
Yeah, you never know what you're going to run into.
Never know.
Never know. So,
Gotta ask.
yep. Like we said, anything transferred with the product is typically going to be exempt as a packaging material. However, you know, if you're purchasing packaging material that's not transferred to the purchaser, something that comes back, something that's returnable. And the biggest thing we always see this with is plastic pallets or plastic totes that you're shipping product in. It gets delivered to your customer, gets unloaded, then it comes back to you and it's used again. Those are not exempt from sales tax or use tax as a exempt packaging material. That would be something taxable because it's transferred to you. So that you always have to be careful about that. I've run into many instances with that for customers, for clients, and you know who've not paid tax on it, and it's come up on an audit, and they've gotten nailed by the state on that. So you got to watch out on non-returnable packaging materials. Labels and tags. Again, labels and tags are typically exempt from sales tax. Not going to get into all this discussion here. There's, you know, if it becomes a critical element of the product sold, it provides useful information, whether it's permanently attached or it's, you know, a label that says fragile or it's an address label, it's got to be exempt from tax. The only thing really on the next slide that you need to watch out for is, you know, if it's an inventory inspection sticker, a lot number tag, anything like that, that's really not useful, not providing any information to the customer, then that wouldn't be taxable. But, you know, in all honesty, I don't think in the years I've ever had done this, and we've done refund claims and audits, labels and tags ever really that big of an issue that we've seen with an auditor. So one last thing here is palletizers. Talked about them earlier. You know, if that palletizer is at the end of the production process, it's taking all those pallets, stacking them, wrapping them, and then sending them off to the warehouse, you're good there. If the palletizer is in the warehouse, though, and it's taking cartons that were already done, already sealed, already in storage, and then taking them and putting them on a pallet and sending them out, then that palletizer in the warehouse is going to be used in distribution and won't qualify for the production exemption. So you have to be careful, you know, where that type of equipment is. Some other exemptions that are commonly used by manufacturers: safety apparel and supplies. Anything from hairnets, lab coats, gloves, eye shields, goggles, boots, beard protectors, the list goes on and on, that are used by production personnel on the production floor are exempt from tax. So that kind of stuff, you can buy sales tax free. I know a lot of times the folks in the office have some goggles too, or they've got the ear plugs and whatnot. Predominant use here. If it's over 50% used in production, I think you're okay.
Yeah, just a word of caution, because we run into this a lot. These are New York State rules.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have multi-state facilities, they have different rules. Some of the states that if this apparel is for the protection of the employee, it's taxable. You think the employee would be important, but
not really.
Apparently state sales tax departments don't think so. So in those particular states, it's only valid, you can only get an exemption if it's for the protection of the product.
Yeah, the gloves to prevent contamination on the product and something like that. So yeah, it gets tricky out there. So next up, just want to talk about quality control. Machinery and equipment and supplies too, used by a manufacturer for quality control of a product while it's still in the production line is exempt from tax. So it still has to be within that production process. After it's, packaged and ready for sale, you can't go back and claim a production quality control exemption on it. Where that quality control function takes place, if you take something off the line and you have a little workstation set up right there, you're doing your testing, checking it out, perfect. If you're taking it to a lab and somebody's looking at it there, no issue. It's all the same thing, but it has to be within the production process. Once it's packaged, ready for sale, at that point, you cannot claim that exemption. So I'm going to pass it over to Andy to talk about his favorite topic, utilities used in production.
Just to finish up with quality control and things you probably don't see every day. I was working out with a facility in the Midwest who's also buying large quantities of detergent. And that particular facility manufactures air-to-air refueling equipment. And I asked them what they were using all this detergent for. And what they were doing is they have a wind tunnel where they unreel the equipment and they test it under wind conditions. And the reason they were buying this detergent is it was the same consistency as jet fuel. So they didn't want to use jet fuel in the facilities, obviously, for the explosive nature of it, and they found this replacement for it. So those purchases did qualify in that particular state for quality control testing. So utilities. Utilities also a two-pronged test. This one's a little tougher though because it's directly and exclusively. So we usually see a couple things when we go out to manufacturing facilities. They're not paying sales tax on any of the utilities, which means that they owe use tax on the portion that's not used in production, or they're paying sales tax on all of it. We haven't found too many that have got it just right where they've actually done a utility study or actually done a utility study recently. We're not going to get into what it takes to figure out the percentage used in New York State for this conversation. We have an upcoming webinar on April 21st where we're going to go into the details of how to calculate this. But basically for utilities, utilities that are used directly in manufacturing are going to qualify. And that's going to be stuff, again, that's out on your shop floor. Utilities that create conditions necessary for production, what they're talking about there is usually like a clean room setting. So HVAC system for that clean room setting is those utilities are going to qualify. And actually forming part of the production process, utilities that you're using in an oven are going to qualify. Here's where it gets tricky though. Utilities have to be an exclusive use, 100% used in production. So when you've got HVAC for your general shop floor, and most manufacturers will argue, I need to keep stuff at a certain temperature, I need to keep a certain humidity. New York State's going to push back and say, well, that's all well and good, but you also have people on the floor that are getting the benefit of that humidity in the temperature control. So you lose your exclusive test. And so general plant heating and cooling is probably not going to qualify. Got the same issue with overhead lighting, except it's not the exclusive use, it's the direct use. So even though we all know we need overhead lighting to manufacture, New York State says that, yeah, that's good that you need it, but you're going to pay sales tax on that electricity.
So it's manufactured
In the dark.
and in the dark. That's good. Perfect.
Yeah.
Sounds like we're on there.
So research and development, we're back to the two-pronged, directly and predominantly. If you're operating any kind of research facility that's scientific or in the technical field or advanced technologies, your equipment is probably going to qualify for that exemption.
Yeah, and I think that would also include, maybe computer software, it's CAD/CAM type software and other types of engineering software that are used to design product. I mean, that would be included in there.
Your development of products, new prototypes, improving existing products. So all the equipment in that area is going to qualify as long as it's used directly and predominantly. What we find is a lot of times some of that equipment that you're using in research and development, you're also using it to make those warranty repairs that I talked about earlier. And so you've got to make sure you've got that over 50% use. Wastewater treatment equipment, pollution control equipment, those things are going to be exempt. Again, they've got to meet the directly and predominantly over 50%. Dust collection equipment, scrubbers on your stacks are going to qualify. Wastewater treatment plant. I can't imagine a wastewater treatment plant where less than 50% of what you're treating is going part of the manufacturing process. Or, either you got a lot of coffee drinkers there that are causing a lot of the effluent, or, I can't imagine what else you'd be running through there that isn't related to a production process if you built a wastewater treatment facility as part of your plan.
Great, thanks, Andy. That pretty much covers all the production exemption points. So wanted to also talk about a few other items, especially related to services that a lot of manufacturers purchase for use in their facilities, kind of give you a more well-rounded view of the different exemptions for sales and use tax, what's taxable and what's not. For the most part, when you're buying services in a state like New York, they are non-taxable unless they are specifically enumerated in the tax law. I remember learning what the word enumerated meant about 25 years ago when I first started doing this as an intern. I don't know why they couldn't just say listed, in the tax law. They had to be enumerated. So very fancy word there.
I'm sure some lawyer could tell you.
Oh, I'm sure. There are services on the next slide here that, talk about that are taxable and non-taxable. Installation, repair, and maintenance of tangible personal property. Now, Andy said if it's production related, right, or if it's in, R&D, or if it's in quality control or whatnot, that would be exempt. But just regular old tangible personal property, an office computer, a printer, copy machine, anything like that, that's going to be a taxable repair. And then my favorite, the installation, repair, maintenance charges related to real property. This is when we talk about construction, capital improvements and whatnot. Any type of repairs to real property has got to be subject to tax. And then, uniform cleaning and rental. This is an interesting one. It's kind of a combination type, service. You see a lot of companies out there, maybe they run uniforms from one of the large providers like a Cintas or somebody like that, and those uniforms are clean. Well, the uniform rental charges, maybe it's pants, maybe it's, some kind of top or whatnot, and then, there's a cleaning charge on there too. Well, the cleaning would be non-taxable. Cleaning and dry cleaning is not subject to tax in New York, but the uniform rental is. So that's typically why you get these long invoices from those types of companies with all these little charges on them, separately stating the cost of each unit piece rented, and then the cleaning charge at the end separately stated. So one's taxable and one's not. Protective and detective services, if you're hiring security guards, that's going to be a taxable service. If you're doing background checks on employees prior to hiring them, if it's done by a licensed private investigator, it's going to be a taxable detective service. If it's done by somebody else, it's still going to be taxable, but it'll just be an information service. Another one we see a lot, drug testing, drug alcohol testing. That is not taxable. That's an exempt service. It's not enumerated in the tax law. And the one I can't believe I forgot janitorial services on this slide. Janitorial services, you hire an outside contractor to come and clean up the plant in the office. That's going to be subject to tax. The next slide here, we talk about installation, repair, and maintenance charges related to real property. This again can be a whole webinar in and of its own on capital improvements. Those services are taxable unless they result in a capital improvement. And with the capital improvement, it has to be a installation or a repair that adds value, becomes part of the real property, and is intended to be a permanent installation. So your typical construction type work, that's a capital improvement. One thing that I always find interesting here as it relates to a manufacturer when it comes to real property and manufacturing is what point is the electric wiring, the heavy 240 volt wiring or plumbing, what part is it related to production and what part is it related to actual construction or part of the building or facility? Typically, when you look at it, if the wiring or cabling that's going from the machine itself to like the outlet or to the box on the wall, that's all going to be considered production. So any type of maintenance to that would be exempt production equipment. Once you hit that wall and everything behind it, then you're getting into the construction, capital improvement, repair and maintenance being taxable line. So that's kind of like the point of demarcation. With plumbing, I would say what point it goes to the drain, or what goes into the wall there. You have a lot of companies with, process piping that's connected to production equipment that would be taxable. So this can be a very confusing, tricky area when you're doing work that involves, stepping down the transmission of the electricity, generators like that, transformers, plumbing, piping related to production. Gets very confusing quickly for sales tax purposes. The next slide, just real quick here as we're getting to the end of our time, self-use of manufactured items. If you're manufacturing something, withdrawing it from inventory and using it in a taxable manner, then you're going to owe use tax on it. It's not, you can't just pull stuff out of inventory and not pay tax on it, if you're using it in a certain manner, if you're giving it away. I think we saw that a lot during COVID, during the pandemic. Manufacturers were maybe giving away to charity masks or gloves or stuff like that. Well, New York didn't provide an exemption for a lot of people who were doing that. You would have to remit use tax on that material unless it was used in an exempt manner. So something to be careful for there. And then another tricky area, I think I mentioned it right at the beginning, manufacturers who are contractors. If you're a manufacturer, you're also installing what you're manufacturing to the real property, then you may not be considered a manufacturer anymore. You may be in this manufacturer, contractor, or fabricator, contractor bucket, and where you owe use tax on what you're manufacturing, and then you have to look at the installation to see whether or not it qualifies as a capital improvement. You see that a lot with like concrete and asphalt manufacturers. That production process isn't considered manufacturing because they're not selling that asphalt. It's not tangible personal property and it's not for sale. They're using it to create real property or installing it on the road. So always have to be careful as to what's manufacturing and what's not. go back to manufacturing tangible personal property for sale. Then you're in, you get the production exemption. So just to wrap things up on our last slide, a couple slides here, paying the correct amount of sales or accruing use tax on purchases is a common problem for manufacturing, right? I mean, Andy, we've been looking at this, helping manufacturers for 20, in his case, over 30, maybe 40 years. We don't really know how old he is at this point, but it's important that you take the time and you conduct a review or hire a third party to review your purchases, not only to see if you're overpaying them and maybe there's a refund out there, but also if you're underpaying. Because at some point or other, you might get a call, you might get a letter in the mail from the Buffalo District Office of the New York State Department of Taxation and Finance asking when they can come out and do an audit. And at that point, I think you want to know whether or not you're owing tax on stuff before that. And there's a lot you can do. You establish those internal controls. Here's the production process. Here's what's exempt based on a department or a cost center or going to accounts. Train the folks, your controller, your accounting folks who are involved in compliance. Train the purchasers so they know what they're buying, right? You can outsource your compliance function. You can do some automation. Some larger companies use some alternative methods, collect the tax due, such as effective rates. That could be a whole other webinar as well. So there's a lot to it. There's a lot of work that people need to do, and everyone's busy. They don't have time to focus on sales tax 100% of the time like Andy and I do. So, please feel free if you have any questions or you need some assistance, maybe you think you have an issue, definitely shoot Andy, shoot me an email. Our email addresses are at the end of the webinar. And then I also kind of included right here just a general list of the information from the tax law to the regulations to the different publications that we use that I looked at, so did Andy, to put these slides together. So definitely go to the state website. There's plenty of information out there on sales tax and manufacturers. And good luck with everything with that. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out. Carolyn?
Great, guys. Thank you. I'm excited about the 3 or 4 more webinars we're going to be doing that you both mentioned today. Thank you.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Like I mentioned, there's going to be post-webinar survey coming to you as soon as this ends. If you could just fill it out, give us some feedback, let us know if you have questions on this topic or others. We can schedule some meetings for you, a phone call, Zoom meeting on that. I will also be sending you an email later today with the presentation again, if you didn't get a chance to download it out of the handouts, and also the recorded version on YouTube. I'll send that, so if you need to watch it again or have one of your colleagues watch it. Before you jump off, just a reminder, Andy mentioned too, our next webinar for April, the topic will be utility studies and savings. So we will see you again in April. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you.